The city's breath was a cold, damp sigh against the shelter's thin windows. Clara lay on a cot that groaned with the weight of 100 other sleepless nights, her hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her belly. Around her, the air was thick with the quiet desperation of other women, each lost in their own storm. She wasn't just hungry. It was a deeper ache, a soul-level emptiness that no meal could fill. She was a ghost in a city of millions, carrying a life that felt more real than her own. Her fingers traced the cool metal of the small medallion around her neck, the only proof she ever had a mother. It was a cold comfort, a symbol of an origin she couldn't claim, and a future she feared her child was destined to repeat. Just yesterday, the reek of bleach had been her only certainty. Now, even that was gone. The manager of the downtown office building had fired her without a second thought, his voice sharp and dismissive in the pristine lobby. "We can't have you getting sick in the restrooms, Clara. It's unprofessional," he'd said, his words echoing off the marble floors as colleagues averted their eyes. The public humiliation was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She hadn't begged or cried, she simply nodded, her dignity a fragile shield against his contempt. She walked out into the harsh sunlight, not just jobless, but branded as an inconvenience, a problem to be discarded. Her pregnancy, a secret source of fragile hope, had become a liability that cost her everything. Now, fear was a constant, suffocating presence. It wasn't the fear of sleeping on the streets or the gnawing hunger that truly terrified her. It was the chilling vision of her own childhood mirrored in her baby's future. She saw a small hand reaching out from a foster home bed, a child asking questions she could never answer. Who am I? Where do I come from? This terror was a fire in her veins, burning away her exhaustion. She would not let her child grow up as a question mark, a footnote in someone else's life. This life, this tiny, innocent being stirring within her, deserved more than a legacy of abandonment. It deserved an identity. It deserved a name. With the last of her crumpled dollars, she bought a subway token. The train rattled through the city's dark arteries, each screech of the wheels a countdown to her final desperate act. Outside, the skyscrapers of Manhattan clawed at the grey sky, monuments to a world she could only view from the outside. She felt invisible, a speck of dust in a universe of wealth and power. Yet clutched in her pocket was a fragile black and white image, an ultrasound photo. It was more than a medical document. It was a testament, a declaration of existence. It was the only weapon she had against the crushing indifference of the world, a silent plea for the one thing she craved not for herself, but for her child: acknowledgement. She stood before the Caldwell Enterprises Tower, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the heavens. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished facade, a tired, pregnant young woman in a worn-out coat, a stark contrast to the sleek, confident figures striding through the revolving doors. Each person who passed by looked through her, their gazes fixed on destinations she could never reach. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The building was a fortress, and she had no army. But then she felt a gentle flutter from within, a tiny reminder of the life depending on her courage. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she clutched the ultrasound photo in her hand and stepped forward, ready to face the man inside. The lobby of Caldwell Enterprises was less a room and more a cathedral to commerce, a vast, sterile space where footsteps echoed like sins in confession. Clara was stopped before she even reached the polished reception desk. A security guard, a man whose uniform was more tailored than her entire wardrobe, blocked her path with an impassive stare. His eyes swept over her worn coat, and the exhaustion etched onto her face, and his judgment was swift and silent. She was not a client. She was not an employee. She was a problem. "Deliveries are made at the service entrance," he stated, his voice flat, dismissing her before she could utter a single word. He didn't see a desperate mother. He saw dirt on a pristine floor, a disruption to the building's perfect, sterile rhythm. She retreated to a corner, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Watching the seamless flow of people, she noticed a group of couriers being waved through with a cursory nod. An idea, born of pure, primal desperation, took hold. It was a lie, a deception, but what choice did she have? When the next delivery cart rolled in, laden with architectural plans, she slipped into the small crowd behind it. pulling her collar up to hide her face. She kept her head down, her body tense, trying to mimic their hurried, purposeful stride. One of the couriers gave her a sideways glance, his brow furrowed in suspicion. In his world of schedules and manifests, she was an anomaly, an unaccounted-for variable. He said nothing, but his look was a verdict. You don't belong here. The elevator ascended with a silent, unnerving speed, a silver cage lifting her into a world she was never meant to see. She was surrounded by the scent of expensive leather and subtle, clean fragrances that seemed a world away from the shelter's perpetual dampness. The men and women inside spoke in low, confident tones about markets and mergers, their gazes occasionally flicking towards her. They didn't stare, but their quick, assessing glances were worse. They took in her frayed cuffs, her anxious posture, and dismissed her entirely. She was invisible and yet scrutinized, a ghost haunting their ascent to power. She clutched the ultrasound photo in her pocket, the crinkled paper her only shield against their silent, crushing contempt. Stepping onto the executive floor felt like entering a vacuum. The air was still, the plush carpet absorbing all sound. Before she could take more than 3 steps, a woman with a severe haircut and a headset materialized before her, an elegant gatekeeper to the throne room. "May I help you?" The question was a scalpel, sharp and sterile, meant to excise any imperfection. Clara's voice, cast when it came, was a fragile whisper. "I need to see Mr. Caldwell. It's personal." The assistant's smile was thin and cold, a perfect mask of corporate politeness that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell doesn't take personal appointments." The finality in her tone was a slammed door, another rejection in a life full of them. This was the judgment of the system, efficient and absolute. Panic seized her. This was her only chance. Over the assistant's shoulder, she saw a set of double doors slightly ajar. She could hear a man's voice, deep and resonant, commanding the room. It had to be him. Ignoring the assistant's sharp intake of breath and her clipped command to wait right there, Clara moved. It wasn't a run. It was a desperate surge forward, a mother animal breaking through a snare. She pushed past the woman, ignoring her gasp of outrage. The act was an invasion, a violation of the unwritten laws that kept her world separate from his. She was crossing a line that was never meant to be crossed, and she could feel the foundations of order trembling beneath her feet as she reached for the door. The conference room fell into a tomb-like silence the moment she entered. A dozen men in dark, expensive suits turned to stare, their faces a mixture of shock and annoyance. At the head of a long, gleaming mahogany table sat Adrian Caldwell. His face was carved from granite, and his eyes, the color of a winter storm, fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. The judgment in the room was a physical force, pressing down on her, suffocating her. They saw a crazy woman, a grifter, a pathetic spectacle disrupting their universe of calculated risks and billion-dollar projections. To them, her presence was not a plea for help. It was an act of aggression, a stain on their immaculate world of power and control. Her hand trembled as she walked toward him, each step feeling like a mile across a battlefield. The security guards were already moving in, their expressions grim. The partners exchanged disgusted glances, whispering about the lapse in security that allowed such a person to get this far. Clara didn't look at them. Her entire world had narrowed to the cold, impassive face of the man at the end of the table. She stopped just before him, took the folded ultrasound photo from her pocket, and with a gesture that took all of her remaining strength, she placed it on the polished surface. The small, black and white image was a bomb dropped into their silent, orderly world. To every man in that room, it was not a picture of a life. It was an accusation, a vulgar piece of blackmail. The immediate aftermath was a chorus of condemnation. "What is the meaning of this?" one partner hissed. Another muttered, "Get her out of here," his voice dripping with revulsion. Adrian's assistant rushed in, apologizing profusely, her face flushed with a mixture of fear and fury at Clara's audacity. Clara stood her ground, a lone, defiant figure in a sea of hostility. She hadn't stolen their wallets or their secrets. She had done something far worse in their eyes. She had brought her poverty, her desperation, and her inconvenient truth into their sanctuary. She had reminded them that a world of pain existed just outside their glass tower, and for that unforgivable sin, they judged her without a shred of mercy. Adrian Caldwell did not look up immediately. He heard the disruption before he saw it, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a discordant note in the symphony of power he conducted daily. When his eyes, cold and sharp as polished steel, finally lifted from the quarterly report, they landed on her. He saw not a woman, but a problem, a variable unaccounted for in his meticulously ordered universe. Her worn coat, her exhausted face, the tremor in her hands, they were all data points that his mind processed with brutal efficiency. She was chaos invading his sterile world of logic and control, and his first silent response was not curiosity or pity, but a deep, chilling irritation. This was an intrusion, and intrusions were to be eliminated. The other men in the room, mirrors of their leader, reacted with a collective and unspoken verdict. Their gazes were weapons, sharp with disdain and suspicion. Whispers slithered across the mahogany table like snakes in the grass. Who let her in? Security is a disgrace. Another one looking for a handout. They saw her pregnancy not as a sign of life, but as a vulgar, manipulative tool. Her desperation was, to them, a performance of weakness designed to prey on their success. She was a ghost from a world they had spent their entire lives building walls to keep out, and her presence was an insult to the very air they breathed, a contamination of their hard-won sanctuary of wealth and influence. Adrian's voice, when it finally came, was devoid of all warmth, a perfectly modulated instrument of dismissal. "You are interrupting a private meeting," he stated, not as a question, but as a final judgment. He didn't ask who she was or what she wanted. Such details were irrelevant. Her very existence in his boardroom was a trespass, a fundamental error that needed to be corrected. He looked past her, toward the door, his eyes already summoning the forces that would restore order to his world. To him, she was an equation to be solved, a nuisance to be erased from the whiteboard of his day. Her humanity was invisible to him, obscured by the fog of his own deeply buried pain. Clara did not flinch under his glacial stare. His coldness was a familiar language, one the world had been speaking to her for years. Inside, a storm of fear and adrenaline raged, but on the outside, she was a statue of maternal resolve. Her feet carried her forward, each step an act of pure will. She ignored the hostile glares and the palpable tension that thickened the air. Her entire being was focused on a single, desperate objective. Reaching the table, her trembling hand emerged from her pocket, not to beg for money, but to deliver a truth. She placed the small, crinkled ultrasound photo on the gleaming wood, a fragile testament to a life that refused to remain a secret. It was her only truth, her only plea. He glanced down at the black and white image. His mind, trained to dissect complex data and identify threats, saw only the obvious pattern: a woman, a pregnancy, and a billionaire. It was a classic, pathetic play for money. He felt a surge of contempt so profound it was almost boredom. He had lawyers for this, systems in place to handle such predictable and vulgar attempts at extortion. The tiny, grainy shape on the paper meant nothing to him. It was not the beginning of a life. It was the beginning of a negotiation, a legal nuisance he would delegate and forget by lunchtime. He had built an empire by never letting emotion cloud his judgment, and this moment would be no different. With a barely perceptible nod, Adrian signaled the two security guards who had entered silently behind Clara. They moved with practiced, non-threatening efficiency, their presence a firm but quiet declaration that her time was up. His executive assistant, her face a mask of mortified professionalism, hurried to his side, whispering apologies for the breach. The corporate machine was working perfectly, isolating and removing the foreign element. To everyone else in the room, the situation was being resolved. The disruption was being contained. Clara was being escorted back to the world outside, where she belonged. The brief, uncomfortable tear in the fabric of their reality was being expertly stitched shut, leaving no trace behind. Before turning back to his partners, Adrian spoke to his assistant, his voice loud enough for Clara to hear. "Catherine, have legal draft the standard agreement. Offer her a settlement in exchange for a DNA test and her signature. I want this handled cleanly and quietly." The words were like stones, each one a calculated blow designed to humiliate and dismiss. He didn't even look at Clara as he said it. She was no longer a person in the room, just a line item in an unfortunate budget, a task to be checked off. He was demonstrating to his partners that nothing could rattle him, that even the most personal of attacks could be reduced to a simple, unemotional business transaction. The guards gently took her arms, their touch a strange mix of formality and force. Clara didn't resist. She had done what she came to do. She had delivered her message, even if it had been received as an insult. As they guided her out of the silent, hostile room, the vast gulf between their two worlds had never felt more real. He was a king in a glass castle, protected by layers of wealth and power, and she was a ghost at his gate. The encounter was over, a brutal collision that left her feeling smaller and more invisible than ever, but the image on the table remained, a silent, stubborn fact in a world built on calculated fiction, waiting for a truth he wasn't yet ready to see. The silence that descended upon the conference room was heavier than the mahogany table at its center. Adrian waved a hand, a sharp, dismissive gesture that cleared the room of his partners and their lingering, crude, judgmental stares. Only he, Clara, and his unnerved assistant, Catherine, remained. He stared at the young woman before him, a stranger who had just detonated a bomb in the heart of his sterile existence. The protocols that governed his life, logic, leverage, dismissal, had vanished. He was left with an uncomfortable, alien feeling, a flicker of connection to her pain. For the first time in a decade, Adrian Caldwell didn't know what to do next, and the uncertainty was a suffocating weight in the perfectly conditioned air. His first instinct was to solve the problem with resources, the only language he still spoke fluently. "Catherine," he ordered, his voice strained, "arrange a car and a suite at the Carlisle, indefinitely." It was a command meant to restore order, a practical solution to a logistical issue, but the words felt hollow, a clumsy application of wealth to a wound that wasn't financial. To him, he was providing safety and comfort. To Clara, who stood rigid and silent, it sounded like he was arranging for her to be moved to a more luxurious cage. She didn't offer thanks or relief. Her silence was a wall, a quiet, powerful resistance against being managed, packaged, and stored away from his life. Catherine, relieved to have a task, approached Clara with a practiced, sterile empathy. "If you'll just come with me, miss, we'll get you settled somewhere much more comfortable," she said, her voice smooth and professional, as if handling a delicate but unwanted piece of art. She reached out to gently guide Clara by the elbow, a gesture of corporate control disguised as kindness. Clara recoiled as if touched by a hot iron. "I don't want your hotel," she stated, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the room's tension. "I didn't come here for your money." The rejection stunned Catherine into silence and reignited the frustration in Adrian's eyes. In his world, no one refused comfort. No one refused his help. The flicker of empathy in Adrian's chest was quickly being choked by his old, familiar armor of impatience. "Then, what is it you want?" he demanded, the coldness seeping back into his tone. The vulnerability she had cracked open was sealing over with suspicion. He couldn't process her motivation. In his experience, every human interaction was a transaction, and her refusal to accept his opening offer could only mean she was holding out for something more. Her pride registered as a negotiating tactic, her dignity as a stubborn, foolish obstacle. The vast, unbridgeable canyon between his world of calculated value and her world of raw survival yawned between them, wider than ever. As if summoned by the tension, his chief legal counsel, a man with a predatory smile and a soul of fine print, strode into the boardroom. He hadn't been briefed on the emotional shift, only on the initial intrusion. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, then turned his condescending gaze on Clara. "Ma'am, my firm has been authorized to make you a very generous preliminary offer. It will ensure both you and this situation are financially secure for the foreseeable future." The word situation landed like a slap, a clinical, dehumanizing term for the life growing inside her. It was the voice of the system, cold and efficient, designed to erase the human element and reduce her child to a line item in a settlement. Clara didn't shout or cry. Her reaction was far more devastating. A profound, bone-deep weariness settled over her features. She looked past the lawyer, her gaze locking onto Adrian's, her eyes shimmering with a sorrow that shamed him more than any accusation could. "You still don't see," she whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "This isn't a situation. It's my child." With that, she turned, her back straight, and began to walk toward the door. She was choosing the shelter, the hunger, the invisibility, over a fortune offered with such profound contempt. She was walking away from his power, proving in that moment that her dignity was worth more than his entire empire. Her retreat shattered his composure. As she walked away, a ghost of a memory ambushed him. His daughter, small and fearless, running ahead of him in a park, her laughter echoing in a life he could no longer access. The instinct to protect, buried for 10 years under layers of grief and cynicism, surged through him with painful force. "Wait," he choked out, the word raw, stripped of all authority. It was not a command, it was a plea. He waved the lawyer away with a furious, dismissive gesture. The rulebook was on fire. He was utterly lost, navigating an emotional landscape he had long since abandoned, and she was the only one who held the map. He struggled for words, his mind racing to find an offer that wasn't an insult. "There's an apartment," he said, the words clumsy and uncertain. "A guest residence. In my building. It's private, quiet. You could stay there." The offer hung in the air, terrifying him as much as it did her. It wasn't about charity, it was about proximity. He was inviting the chaos into his fortress, offering a key to the very woman who had just breached its walls. Every rational instinct, every lesson learned from a decade of self-imposed isolation screamed that this was a catastrophic mistake. The cold CEO was at war with the forgotten father, and the battle was raging in the space between them. Clara stopped, her back still to him. She could feel the eyes of his assistant on her, could feel the silent judgment. Accepting this offer felt like a different kind of surrender. A hotel was anonymous, temporary. His building was his sanctuary. To enter it was to step fully into a world that had tried to crush her, to become dependent on the man who had first offered contempt. She was terrified of the strings that would surely be attached, of the power he would hold over her and her child. Was this just a more sophisticated cage, one with a better view? Trust was a foreign concept, a luxury she had never been able to afford, and he had done nothing yet to earn it. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of gratitude or relief. It was a concession born of pure, pragmatic exhaustion and the fierce, primal need to protect her baby from the cold nights ahead. It was a truce, not a peace treaty. The tension in the room did not dissolve. It merely changed its shape. The conflict was no longer about a confrontation in a boardroom, but about the terrifying, fragile intimacy of shared space. They were two strangers from different planets, bound by a future life, and they had just agreed to stand on the same unstable ground, knowing the slightest tremor could send them both falling. The guest residence was less a home and more a statement of wealth, a silent, sprawling space on the 50th floor. It was a world of muted greys, polished chrome, and glass walls that framed the city like a captured, glittering beast. Clara walked through the rooms, her worn sneakers soundless on the plush, immaculate carpet. There were no photographs on the walls, no books on the shelves, no sign that a human life had ever left its mark here. It was beautiful, sterile, and profoundly lonely. She felt the same suffocating emptiness she'd felt in his boardroom, only now it was magnified, echoing in the vast, silent rooms. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach. She wasn't just an intruder here. She was a fragile, living thing in a place that felt like a mausoleum. Adrian arrived an hour later, not as a host, but as an administrator. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the bleeding sunset. He didn't ask if she was comfortable. He began outlining the terms of her stay as if dictating a corporate memo. "A monthly stipend will be deposited into an account for you. I have arranged for the best obstetrician in the city. My legal team will draft the necessary documents tomorrow for your signature." Each word was a brick being placed back into the wall between them. He was trying to regain control, to turn her and her child back into a manageable project, a series of transactions that could be tracked, managed, and eventually closed. Clara listened to the litany of provisions, her silence a stark contrast to his clipped, efficient tone. He mistook her quietness for a negotiating tactic, a prelude to a demand for more. The thought hardened him further. confirming his initial cynical assessment. "Is this arrangement not to your satisfaction?" he finally asked, turning from the window, his voice edged with impatience. "If you believe this is an opportunity to extract a fortune, you are mistaken. This is a practical solution to ensure the child is cared for, nothing more." His words were cold, precise, and designed to put her back in her place, to remind her that this was an act of calculated necessity, not of kindness or connection. Instead of responding to his offer, Clara looked at the hollow space where a family portrait should have been. Her voice, when it came, was soft, yet it pierced the sterile atmosphere like a shard of glass. "Did you ever want to be a father?" she asked. The question was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that it bypassed all his defenses. It wasn't about money or leverage. It was a simple human inquiry that had no place in the world of contracts and settlements. He was trying to build around them. He stared at her, momentarily speechless. For the first time, someone had not asked him for something he had, but about something he had lost. The armor around his heart cracked under the weight of those 7 simple words. The question opened a door in his mind he had kept bolted for a decade. He was no longer in a luxury penthouse. He was in a sun-drenched park. He could hear the squeak of a swing set and the sound of a little girl's laughter, a sound so pure it was a physical ache in his chest. He saw his daughter, Lily, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream, holding up a fistful of dandelions for him. "For you, Daddy," she had said, her eyes shining with unconditional love. The memory was a ghost, a beautiful, torturous spectre that reminded him of a man he no longer was. The cold CEO faltered, and for a fleeting second, the grieving father looked out from behind his eyes, lost and devastated. Clara saw the shift, the sudden, profound pain that washed over his features. She saw the billionaire vanish, replaced by a man drowning in an invisible ocean of sorrow. In that moment, she felt not fear or triumph, but a surprising surge of empathy. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the one thing that connected her to her own past, the small, tarnished silver medallion her mother had left her. She held it out on her palm, not for him to inspect, but as a shared offering of loss. "This is all I have of my family," she whispered. "I don't want your money, Mr. Caldwell. I just want my child to have more than this. I want them to know they weren't a mistake." Her confession was the final, devastating blow. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a declaration of a mother's deepest desire. He had assumed her motive was greed, the oldest and simplest of sins. But he was wrong. She wasn't fighting for a share of his fortune. She was fighting for her child's identity, for their right to exist without shame. He finally understood the ultrasound photo was not a threat, but a birth announcement, delivered in the only way she could. He had offered her a settlement for her silence, when all she had ever wanted was for him to hear her child's name. The depth of his misjudgment, of his cruelty, left him reeling. His gaze fell upon the ultrasound photo, which she had placed on a marble side table when she entered. He had looked at it before and seen only a problem, a potential lawsuit printed on thermal paper. Now he saw it with new eyes. He saw the delicate curve of a spine, the shadow of a tiny, perfect hand. He saw a life he had co-created and then dismissed with contempt. It was a ghost of the future he had lost with Lily and, impossibly, a flicker of a future he never imagined he could have. The black and white image was no longer an accusation. It was an invitation, a chance to be someone other than the empty shell he had become. The carefully constructed fortress of Adrian Caldwell crumbled into dust. It was not a storm, but a quiet, internal collapse. He sank heavily into an armchair, the immense effort of maintaining his cold facade for 10 long years finally exhausting him. A ragged breath escaped his lips, the first sound of genuine emotion he had allowed himself in a decade. He looked at Clara, his eyes stripped of all arrogance, filled only with a profound, shared sorrow. "Her name was Lily," he said, the words a raw, painful whisper. He was confessing his deepest wound to the stranger who had inadvertently found the key to its lock. Clara did not rush to comfort him or offer empty platitudes. She recognized the sanctity of his grief and simply stood her ground, her presence a silent testament of witness. She gave him the one thing no one else had, the space to be broken. In that shared, heavy silence, the vast chasm between them closed. The power, the money, the judgment. It all dissolved, leaving only two people scarred by loss, standing at the precipice of a new beginning. They were no longer a billionaire and a desperate woman. They were a father and a mother, bound by a life that was yet to come. The war was over. The healing had just begun. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear your story. The silence that followed his confession was not empty. It was filled with the weight of a decade of unspoken grief. Adrian finally looked up from the floor, his eyes clear of the cold arrogance that had defined him. He saw Clara not as a problem to be managed, but as a woman who had endured a different kind of loss, the loss of a past. "Stay," he said, the single word a quiet surrender. "Not in a hotel, here, in this building. This is not a transaction, Clara. It's a sanctuary. It's the least I can do for the child." He didn't offer it as a gift of his wealth, but as a necessary act of protection. Clara studied his face, seeing the broken father beneath the billionaire. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, accepting not his charity, but a truce for the sake of the life she carried. In the days that followed, Adrian's actions spoke a language of sincere, fumbling care. He didn't delegate. He acted. He personally scheduled an appointment with the city's best obstetrician, handing Clara the confirmation not as an order, but as a quiet offering. He made sure the kitchen was stocked, not with extravagant delicacies, but with simple, nourishing food. Watching her eat a real meal at a quiet table, her shoulders finally relaxing after months of tension, he felt a profound shift within him. This was not about restoring his control, it was about providing a fundamental, human comfort he had long forgotten. Each small act of service was a quiet apology for his initial cruelty, a brick being laid in the foundation of a fragile, unspoken trust between them. One evening, he found her standing by the vast window, holding the ultrasound photo against the glass, as if showing the city to her unborn child. He approached cautiously, the space between them no longer a battlefield but a tentative middle ground. Have you thought about a name?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The question was a landmark. The first time he had spoken of the baby as a person with a future. Clara turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "If it's a girl," she whispered, "I was thinking of hope." The word hung in the air between them, simple and yet monumental. It was more than a name. It was a prayer, and for the first time, he felt he was a part of it. The next day, Adrian returned to the apartment, carrying a small, simple silver frame. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the side table, took the crinkled ultrasound photo, and carefully placed it inside the frame. He set it upright, transforming the piece of paper from a symbol of her desperate plea into the first official portrait of their unconventional family. It was a gesture more powerful than any check he could have written. He was giving her child a place of honor in his home, in his life. He was validating their existence. Clara watched, her hand over her heart, tears welling in her eyes not from sorrow, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of being seen. Her child was no longer an accusation. They were a presence. A new quiet settled into the sterile apartment, a peace that was less about silence and more about the absence of fear. The vast empty rooms began to feel less like a cage and more like a nest, slowly being warmed by the promise of a new life. They existed in a shared space, two solitary souls learning the rhythm of coexistence. He would leave a glass of milk on the counter for her before bed. She would leave the morning paper on the table for him. These small, unspoken gestures were the first threads of a connection being woven in the wreckage of their pasts. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was the dawn of something far more precious, a shared hope, fragile and fierce, taking root against all odds. Months later, the sterile apartment had been transformed. Soft light now pooled on a small, hand-assembled crib in the corner, and the scent of lavender replaced the cold smell of glass cleaner. Clara moved with a newfound serenity, her steps no longer hurried by fear, but measured by the gentle rhythm of the life within her. She was no longer a ghost haunting the city's edges. She was an architect, carefully building a future from the fragments of her past. She would often hold the small silver medallion up to the light, not as a symbol of what was lost, but as the first chapter in a story she would one day tell her daughter, a story of origins, of resilience, and of a mother who walked through fire to give her a name. Her strength once a shield for survival, had become a foundation for peace. Adrian's transformation was quieter, but just as profound. The impenetrable fortress he had built around his heart had been dismantled, not by force, but by the persistent, gentle presence of hope. He no longer filled his evenings with sterile reports and empty silence. Instead, he would sit with Clara, listening to the soft music she played, learning the foreign language of domestic peace. One afternoon, she found him in the nursery, his large hands fumbling awkwardly with the instructions for a baby monitor. He looked up, a sheepish, unfamiliar smile on his face. In that moment, he was not the titan of industry, but simply a man preparing to be a father again. His grief for Lily no longer a ghost that haunted him, but a gentle memory that taught him how to love again. One evening, they stood together by the great window, the city lights a sprawling galaxy beneath them. The silence between them was no longer a weapon, but a shared breath. "I used to bring Lily up here," Adrian said softly, his voice thick with memory. Town she called the cars firefly bugs. He didn't speak with the raw pain of before, but with a tender nostalgia that filled the space between them with warmth. Clara placed her hand on his arm, a simple gesture of understanding that spoke volumes. "Hope will love to hear stories about her big sister," she whispered. In that shared moment, looking out at the vast, indifferent city, they were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance, but the quiet, certain beginning of a family, forged in loss and rebuilt by grace. They spoke of that first day only once, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the framed ultrasound photo between them. Adrian finally found the words. "I saw a transaction," he confessed, his gaze unwavering. "I looked at you, and all my pain, all my cynicism, saw a threat. I'm sorry I didn't see the mother." Clara listened, her heart aching not with the old wound, but with empathy for the man he had been. "And I saw a monster," she admitted quietly. "I didn't see the father who had lost everything." It was not an exchange of blame, but a mutual offering of forgiveness. They were acknowledging the broken people they had been, honoring the scars that had, or impossibly, led them to this place of healing and quiet understanding. The day hope was born, the world outside the hospital room ceased to exist. Adrian was there, his hand a steady anchor in hers, his presence a quiet promise he never broke. When the nurse placed the tiny, swaddled bundle in his arms, the last of his walls turned to dust. He looked down at his daughter's face, and in her impossibly new eyes, he saw not the ghost of the child he had lost, but the miraculous, undeniable proof of a second chance. Tears streamed down his face, washing away a decade of frozen grief. Clara watched him, her own tears falling freely. The desperate plea she had made in that boardroom had been answered in a way she never dared to imagine. Her daughter had a name, a future, and a father who loved her. Years later, in a sun-drenched park, the sound of a child's laughter echoed near a swing set. Adrian pushed his daughter, Hope, her small legs kicking with delight, her face a perfect blend of his features and Clara's resilient spirit. Clara watched from a nearby bench, a peaceful smile on her face. The ultrasound photo, once a desperate plea clutched in a cold hand, now sat in a silver frame on Hope's bedside table. It was a testament not to a beginning born of pain, but to the unshakable truth that a single, fragile image of life could be enough to save two lost souls. Dignity, she had learned, wasn't something you were given. It was something you built, one act of hope at a time. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to believe in new beginnings.